Well, good morning. It's a Friday, very cold Friday. So hopefully if you were lucky enough to still be home, you get warm, get an umbrella, jacket, something. This is time for Take Note. I'm Flavia Tumusime. Today is quite important. It's the 2nd of November. It's the International Day to End Impunity for crimes against journalists, and they're saying that there's very low conviction rates, not just here in Uganda, worldwide. The journalists who are supposed to be the feed of information to the public are not able to give the right information to the public because of a few nudges here and there. To have this discussion, face you're very familiar with, I couldn't talk about journalists and not bring him, human rights advocate, lawyer, Nicholas Opio. You might be the Jesus of journalists at this point now. Good morning.
Thank you for having me, Flavia. Good to be in your company and the company of my good friend.
Yes, and your good friend and I are meeting for the first time, Wokulira Sebagala. I've asked how long have you been a practicing journalist? All his life.
I have been.
That's the right way to say it. All your life.
All my life.
So I was told it's important that if I'm going to have this discussion about impunity against journalism, that you would have good stories to tell. Now, gentlemen, if we're going to protect journalists, someone said we need to also know what journalists are supposed to do.
Yeah.
Yes?
True.
Because you can't do the wrong thing and then be protected.
Anyway, it also depends on who defines the wrong.
Exactly. Who chooses what's the right story to tell and what's the wrong story to tell. So, as a journalist, you know that there are rules and codes that govern the professional that is journalism.
Thank you, Flavia. Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to be
with your friend.
I've known him for the last, I think, over a decade. Yeah. So
I'm not that old, so
because then we're going to start at 50, 45, thereabouts. Yes.
Yeah, but the question you've asked, like any other profession, of course, journalism has its own rules.
Yes.
Which, of course, once you decide to take on this professional duty, you've got to adhere to those standards, which, of course, all of us, we believe in independency. The media has got to be independent, but they also need to be accurate, objective, fair. I mean, we also need to bring out our products when they are really balanced, not one-sided. I mean, so I believe really there are standards, which I think UNESCO has done quite a lot into bringing those standards really across the board. And for the last 7-8 years, we also had what we call a campaign, which was intended to help media houses have these pinned in their newsroom wall.
So we are reminded
every
time we go to the newsroom, we know.
Exactly. So whenever we would go out of the newsroom, those standards are there. But of course, where you feel that things are not really doing well, there are reasons also why. So when you look at why journalism has not really, because it's a world over issue.
Yes.
Journalists are targeted because literally they are being blocked from telling the truth. And you know, particularly in Africa, most government thrives on the ignorance of the people. So when the media or a journalist comes out to tell what is happening, one, they fear that this information is going to, these people are going to be empowered. And once they're empowered, they are going to
do something about it. Yes.
Which of course challenges their power. And maybe they will not even stay in power. So you see, journalists have been really, we've tried to be good messengers. But at the end of the day, because of the pressures, not only external, but even internal, not only political, but they're also economic, you find that, of course, you are really in the corner. And you have to look around and say, okay, if I want to stay in journalism, what am I supposed to be doing? My experience has been really very nasty when it comes to my profession.
Yes.
Because when I went to school, I wanted always to be a journalist. And I worked at one of the Radio Sapiencia for about 8 years. But I rose through the ranks. So from a reporter to a producer to and then until I went to be
what is the
what is the at the top?
To a show host.
To a show host, because I would sanction what goes on air.
Yes.
But things really were not really the way I was managing my show or my journalistic kind of work
Yes.
wasn't really pleasing some sides. And how I lost it was an order that if you don't sack Sebagala, we're going to
Close you
cancel
down.
your license and
Okay.
you go off.
Okay.
So
Which I'm sure is a story that has happened to many.
exactly, it has been really
Yes.
here. Some have, I'm happy that I'm still alive, but some have even lost their lives. But what is also important is that even because when I was really pushed out of Radio Sapiencia, I believed that that was not the end of the world. I never
Okay.
knew that I would be at Radio Sapiencia, but I found myself there. So I knew that.
But
after
let
I
me
was
ask you,
seeing-
in a point when you're told, okay, first of all, I need to say this. We're in newsrooms, so we need to be very careful. I think Nicholas can go wherever he wants to go with this, but not us. But I've always said that in that, when someone said, is it possible for journalists to be neutral? I think that's what they were supposed to be, not take sides, as they say it. And you know, because sometimes you're saying, I'm giving both sides, but there's a clear understanding of which side you might be falling to.
Flavia, we are all human beings.
Yeah.
But you always want to bring your professional standards always to be
At the
benchmark.
fore.
Exactly.
Yes.
If really I want to do a story, personally I've been a human rights journalist, I think, since I started practicing journalism. And I've always wanted to be so. But being a human rights journalist, I feel empathy for the victims. I empathize.
Empathy is a feeling.
Yes.
Feeling that could somehow
Exactly.
make you
This
subjective.
is what I'm saying. But at the same time, I would look at myself and say, yes, if I am a journalist, I'm supposed to write about this violation or this abuse.
Yes.
But then I do not stop at that. If I have written, I always want to do it in a professional way, that people will not judge me. But behind the curtain, I have some work that I'm supposed to do.
You said human rights, and Nicholas, in human rights, because you're well versed to it, do we ever ask the question of why the person who's violating the human right, why they're doing that? What has led them to do that? Do we ever question that?
I don't believe that for psychologists
Okay.
and anthropologists to explain the reason for their violation. The point in which we must start is that there is no justification for torture and violation of the rights of a journalist, whose simple duty really is to shine a light
On what's
and
happening.
to report. And I think for me, to go back to the earlier question you asked about neutrality, let nobody deceive you that they are neutral. Nobody is neutral. We cannot be neutral.
That's very true.
The most important thing for a journalist is just to be factual. As long as you're factual, that is, I think, for me, the best you can do, because neutrality is a myth. All of us have prejudices, all of us have beliefs that percolate into our work somewhat. So I think that the most important thing for a journalist is to be factual. The second thing for me that a journalist must do is to be conscious journalism, so that when you are presented with a story, you must ask the question, what is behind the story? What are the facts behind the story? I think far too many times journalists have become purveyors of information passed on to them by other people who have other,
motives.
motives.
As well.
So you must be a thinking, conscious, and factual journalist if you're to be a good journalist. But it is precisely because of the factual nature of the profession that journalists find themselves at the receiving end of heinous violations. Because journalism and journalists are really the last bastion between the power of the state and the citizenry. They are the only people between that space that will hold to account leaders for the things they do in public office. And so because of that role, journalists find themselves in a space where if you are covering a riot and there's a policeman who is pinching somebody with a plier and you're reporting it, in order to be able to damage that evidence, they will beat you up.
Which I think some of the
They
pictures
will.
that are being relayed.
These are recent pictures,
Yes,
but if you go
very
far
recent.
back as 2009...
It's not a 2018 problem.
Yeah.
It's like-
And I give you one example. In 2009, a photo editor at The Observer at the time, Edward Ichwalu, was capturing violations during Uganda riots in downtown Kampala. He was beaten severely, his camera was damaged, his photos were deleted. So these things have been here forever. it is not that this is just beginning this year. It has characterized state relations with the media, not just in Uganda, but in many places across the world. So I think, for me, journalists must not cower or give in to the threats that they face because of reporting the truth. You must stick to reporting the truth no matter the cost. Only then will you be able to be a good journalist. The second thing for me is that, of course, this kind of beatings impact people's lives significantly. If you haven't been beaten, you have no idea what that means to your life. You have family, you have relatives, you have a job to keep, you know, people to feed. And so when you are beaten in the way that James Akena perhaps was beaten, you begin to reflect at a very personal level. So these things have an impact on people's lives.
Yes.
What we then must be able to do is that use occasions such as this day to shine a light on the importance of journalism and on the importance of holding to account people who beat up journalists in the course of their duty. I think that we have taken our eyes away from holding to account these individuals, and we're only reporting the incidences. I think, for me, we have to narrow down and begin to question. In the video that you're just showing now, there's a police commander from CPS who was commanding the beating of this journalist. We know them. I think focus must shift to holding these individuals to account.
Yes, and I think that will be a good, because on such a day they're saying that the biggest problem worldwide is the low conviction rate for these violent crimes. They're not saying in Uganda. They're saying in the world. You understand? And you look at that picture, because, I mean, we saw the pictures, and I think the point was saying that if somebody puts their hands up and all they're holding is really a camera, to be honest, I mean, what more? But you see, journalists are reporting what is happening to a journalist, and it's being put out there. You spoke about the Uganda riots. Brought me to a particular point, because I was in both radio and TV at the time, and it was quite a sensitive time, I think we remember. See, what you were saying, neutrality can't be achieved, is because you, say you're in Uganda, Sebagara, Oliku Radio, you subscribe to Sabasajja, but you are a journalist, and someone called and says, "Oh, manche bakola abantu baffe." They appeal to the Muganda first, the journalists later. But you have a forum where when you press on air and open the mic, you're speaking to thousands who might not be Baganda. You understand? But you're also speaking to the Baganda. And I feel like that's the one example, Nicholas, where people did not exercise neutrality. There was a bit of, I subscribe to this and I will say what I want to say. So I want to ask, if we, as much as want to end impunity against the crimes against journalists, do we also ever take responsibility for what we bring to the table?
Yes.
Not the cause of the beating, but what we bring to the table.
True, we have. This has happened. Like I mentioned before Nicholas came in, that there were, for the last 7 to 8 years, we had started on a process of self-regulation that would look into our own issues, would need to collect ourselves, any challenge that we're able really to focus and address it in a way that we're building our profession. But you cannot really be regulated, you cannot be guided, you cannot be, mentored by an external person who has never studied, who is not even part of your profession, but this person is there, one, he has been given a job to regulate you, and everything falls within his or her. Should
the regulator not be state-owned?
No, I have no problem. Well, there must be really processes.
Because maybe that's a thin line.
Yeah, but there must be really process. I don't care, because world over, governments
regulates.
They regulate.
Yes.
But you allow other processes to take shape, like self-regulation. Say, if I admit there is a problem, how do I avoid it again? But even if somebody whom you don't think that is helping you to grow, anything happens to you, you will say it has happened because he or she is because of this. In other way, you will not take it really in good faith. So for me, I'm like, yes, we also have mistakes. We also feel there are certain things that we fall short.
Yes.
But then we do not have a learning space.
Okay.
peer to peer, where I mean people like the lawyers. I mean, for them, they even have an annual gathering where they meet, reflect on the entire year, how they, I mean, what has happened.
Is this true, Nicholas?
It is. The Uganda Law Society has an annual general assembly.
I mean,
Where you check yourselves?
Where we elect leaders, where we set rules of
I mean, we
engagement.
need to have, we need to look at processes
The
like
processes,
that.
yes.
I mean, you
yes.
begin at that.
I think the point you're making is an important point, and I think the point has to be honed a little bit. And the point is this: that we must reclaim the profession of journalism.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because journalism is a profession. There are people who go to school for 4 years to study this thing, okay, and they know the ethical requirements to be a journalist. They know the rules, okay. So we must reclaim the profession of journalism, because that is a noble profession. In fact, at some point, the three most difficult courses to get into are law, medicine, and journalism, because it's such an important part of our society. What we have actually done is now the line between a professional journalist and somebody who uses the media house to express themselves has been blurred. And therefore, questions of standards, questions of qualifications don't seem to matter anymore. So we must reclaim the practice of journalism.
It is what we need to. So on such a day, Nicholas, because you have been at the helm of helping journalists who've been affected in one way or another. I know, I think, is the Uganda police still ranking at #1 on human rights violator?
No, it has ranked
for so many years.
Even when I was still at HRA.
Oh, wow. Has it changed now?
It's gotten worse.
Okay.
That's the change
that has happened.
Yeah.
So in instances like that where you have been dealing with the journalists and dealing with the law, what is our success rate in terms of conviction, in terms of getting answers, in terms of justice?
I think that the point, even before you get to conviction, is to ask the commitment of the prosecutorial arm of the state to take interest
in such cases.
I don't think they do. I think that on many occasions, the interest of the state is not to protect journalists, is not to prosecute those who violate the rights of journalists. You know, I was 2 years ago in Kasese with your good friend Joy Doreen,
yes,
who was, you know, arrested and accused of abetting terrorism for simply suspicion of being, you know, in a place where there were violations. Nobody cared about why her right was violated and who did that, and they should be held to account. We focused on getting her out, we got her out, but those who violated her rights were never prosecuted. In 2009, Kalundi Robert Teromaga was yanked out of a TV studio, put in a booth of a pickup, of a premiere. They tried to gouge his eyes out because he said some things about the president. Nobody has held anyone to account for that. In fact, to date, he's been banned from hosting shows on radio and TV. And so I think that there's not been focused on protecting journalists. And I think we need to begin to make that a point so that by the time we get to convictions, we have enough cases being brought. The only case that in recent memory was brought was against the DPC of Old Kampala, but even then, that was pushed by a private prosecution, and the state eventually came on board much later. And so I think that we need to begin to hold to account people who violate the rights of journalists. Only then shall we get convictions. If the DPP is interested in that, if the OCCID, the CD director is interested in investigating cases of violations against journalists. In the recent case of Akena, the president justified the beating. Instead of condemning it and committing to an investigation with the view of holding to account people who were seen beating somebody who was really helpless, just holding a camera. So I think that we must begin to ask the powers that be, who have the responsibility to investigate these cases, to investigate cases against journalists who have been beaten. And there are names and numbers. We have names of police officers who have been beating journalists. We have evidence. If the state just doesn't have evidence, we can provide this evidence. So I think that
that interest is lacking.
That interest is lacking, and primarily because a decadent state, an autocratic state, or a state that is not democratic, thrives on ignorance, thrives on opaqueness, and journalists who shine a light on these violations
are a threat?
Become an enemy, not just a threat, become an enemy. I can give you the case of your other colleague from a sister TV station who was covering a live coverage at Dr. Besigye's house. And because she was doing a live coverage, she was quickly arrested, put in a van, her breast was fondled, she was beaten, she was locked up on a very hot day for hours on end at Kasangati police station.
And nothing.
It took the intervention of Afande Felix Kawesi, may his soul rest in peace, to get her released. Even after she was released and she went and told her story at the African Commission, the Minister of Justice called her when she was on her way back and gave her an earful.
Oh,
you would think that the Minister of Justice would be concerned about what happened to her and call her to commiserate with her and to try and commit to an investigation. And so we need to begin to highlight this kind of cases and report it. I think media houses must also begin to report about themselves. You're reporting too much about other people and not looking after your own. I think we must begin to highlight.
We must stay on these cases.
Yes.
We must absolutely shine the brightest light and say it's happening.
For me, Flavia and Nicholas, for me, what I am seeing, things have changed, which of course we must really push for more to be done, because then
what is the change, though?
The change in terms of how the media has tried to focus on their own issues. Even before we formed Human Rights.
I think a lot of the issues being brought forward are being brought up by citizen journalists.
Yeah, but
they are just take out their phones and
take a picture.
There has been really tremendous improvement, because you see a journalist standing with you, standing with the fellow journalist, really for protection, but at the same time, even someone has been taken to court, you see a big number of journalists escorting him. Even someone has been summoned for police interrogation. We're there. This did not happen our early days. It's until when we formed HRNJ that we tried to focus more on how do we build solidarity.
But what if something like that happens? A journalist is being beaten, and instead of giving someone else that mileage, we focus on that. Do you see what I mean? Yes. I think the turnover, we move on very quickly from our own issues.
Exactly.
We move on very quickly.
We do, but of course we also understand the politics in the media, in the newsroom.
Yes, as well.
The media house will not give you space. For instance, like a journalist who was beaten in northern Uganda, in Arua, sorry. You do what you can, because this is also looking at different aspects. In terms of being a business entity, of course they've got to look for means to survive.
Your license is regulated by someone.
Yes. All these are, I've got to be into consideration. But of course, as journalists in the newsroom, even when we don't really bring more on the camera, but I think newsrooms internally, we need to also to continue deliberating and discussing what affects us and how do we get out of it.
Yes.
Let me speak to media owners who perhaps are concerned about
who's
figures.
Regulating us.
No, they're concerned about bottom line. Okay? It's about figures. That they will never make that money unless they have journalists who feel safe and can do a good job.
That's true.
And I think that media owners must not just focus on the money, the advertising revenue, but must focus on the people who make them this money. Without Flavia sitting up this morning and delivering quality programming for the morning show, the NTV may not make as much money. So we must look at you as an asset and begin to make investments to the protection of the journalists who sacrifice their lives to bring us the news and make these media houses thrive. I pity particularly cameramen and women who bring us these pictures, the things they go through. I have spoken to people like NTV's Galiwango, and he has nasty experiences of, being at the scene of a riot and being able to capture those images and bring it to us. When you have to avoid the police, you have to capture the image, you have to stay safe. Journalists now move like a herd of cattle when they're covering a story, because that's the only way they get protection.
I think, like you said, it's unfortunate we're running out of time, but Sebagal especially, please allow come back soon, and we talk about how to maybe change that newsroom, how to work for ourselves. Like you said, that the bottom line, yes, but even the journalists, I'm sure, can, as we move as herd of cattle on the on the streets, if we can do it as well in the newsroom, maybe we can find our own answers. Today is the International Day of Ending Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. So please go online somewhere and get familiar with these cases, even if you're not a journalist. The work of journalists is really for the public. The thankless, is a thankless job?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing a service.
It's a service.
Yeah, it's a
It's
service.
a thankless
We are not like
job.
lawyers, yeah? So,
Oh,
but
okay.
of course, Flavia, there's something
As a wind up,
as a
yes.
wind up, yeah. I mean, I think we also, like Nicholas talked about, really pushing really institutions that are responsible for prostitutes.
To take some initiative and some
exactly.
interest.
The United Nations process, which is UPRM, had about 4 or 5 recommendations.
We are pressed for time. That's why I'm saying you have to come
Yes.
back.
I will, but
Thank you so
nothing
much.
has happened, you know. They
Yeah.
have not been implemented.
That's Wokulira Sebagala, practicing journalist, as you can hear. And he will be back. And Nicholas Opie, of course, human rights advocate, who's always here. You're always welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Father.
That's it for Morning at NTV. Have a good weekend.